Ladies and gentlemen, let us now officially begin Conference 1 of the 2014 World Journalists Conference. I would like to introduce to you now our moderator, Professor Park Jin. Currently, he is the endowed chair professor at the Graduate School of International and Area Studies of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Park has also served in 3 sessions of the National Assembly and has also served as the chairman of the Foreign Affairs, Trade, and National Unification Committee of the National Assembly. Really, with his knowledge and experience, he should be giving his own special lecture today rather than moderating. But even still, it is our great pleasure to have him with us to move things along. And without further ado, I hand over the mic to Dr. Park Jin.
Good afternoon. My name is Jin Park, and welcome to the conference, first session of the World Journalist Conference 2014. We're still waiting for Mr. Simon Mundy from Financial Times. But we would like to start anyway. The topic this afternoon is an extension of the morning session in terms of the situation on the Korean Peninsula and the prospects for denuclearization, especially from the viewpoint of the six-party talks. And I understand you had a good chance to ask questions and discuss the issue with the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Cho Tae-yong, in the morning and the lunch session. Now, I have 5 distinguished guest speakers from the various media organizations representing the countries involved. Just got the note that Mr. Simon Mundy will arrive at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so we will start it. Let me introduce the participants of this session. First of all, from my far right is Mr. Lee Ha-won from TV Chosun. Chosun, as you know, is a leading major newspaper in this country, and which also has the television broadcasting station called TV Chosun. And now we have the editor, Mr. Lee Ha-won, who is a editor of the Chosun TV Joseon, and also was a former correspondent in Washington, representing the Chosun Ilbo. And he was a delegate of the Korea, China, Japan Future Leaders Forum, and is graduated from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Please give a big round of applause for Mr. Lee Ha-won. And then we have Господин Sergei Strokhan from Russia. He's a political commentator of the Kommersant, the major publishing house in Russia. Mr. Strokhan is a journalist, essayist, and a poet. It's very impressive. And he's also a political commentator with the Kommersant, and he also hosts the Red Line, a weekly analytical program broadcast by the Voice of Russia in New York City. This is a radio broadcasting station, so he's a talk show host to this very famous program. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Strokhan, please give a big round of applause. And then we have a lady from Japan, Tanaka Miya-san, who is a World Services Section staff reporter of the Kyodo News. And you may well know the name of this important Japanese news agency representing the country. She has been working for the English language news program for the Kyodo News Service since 2001, and covering politics, social, and energy issues. And also she covered the Prime Minister's office, especially under Mr. Fukuda Yasuo, between 2007 and 2008. And she also covered the day-to-day events concerning the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Tanaka Miya. And last but not least, we have Wang Xiaohui 先生 from China, Mr. Wang, who is an editor-in-chief of the China Internet Information Center in China. He joined the Xinhua News Agency in 1987 after graduating from Nankai University, and he was a manager of the London office of Xinhua and also vice president of Xinhua Financial Holding and CEO of China.com. You may be very well aware of this .com media organization. And now he was a deputy director of the China Internet Information Center, and now he's an editor-in-chief of the Chinese Internet Information Center. And we all know that in China, the numbers of the netizens have been exploding. There's hundreds of millions of Chinese population coming into the internet digital communications to let their views known to the country and to the world. So before I begin, I would like to ask all the participants, the distinguished panelists, to present their views on the issue related to the six-party talks and the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, especially North Korea, and the prospects for unification. I would like to ask each panelist to present about 5 to 10 minutes of their views, after which we open our discussion for questions and answer session. Let me first start with Mr. Wang from China. Mr. Wang, are you ready?
Yes,
Would you like to use the screen? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Wang from China, please. Welcome. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wang Xiaohui from china.org.cn. And it is a 10-language multimedia website of news and information in China. And it is a great privilege to come here and attend and make presentation at the World Journalist Conference 2014. As requested by the organizer, I will focus my speech on the subject of a peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. I'm not an expert on Korean issues, but as a journalist, my colleagues and I have been following closely each and every step of progress and setbacks in the process of a reunification of the peninsula. It's a complex and complicated issue, shaped and influenced by many factors, historical, present, military, and so on. However, no matter how difficult and how complicated it is, we all believe that in the long run, the peninsula will be reunited. This observation is reinforced each time I watch TV, covering the family reunion of the North and the South. White-haired brothers, crying mothers and sons, hugs and tears, always touch the tender part of the hearts of the audience. And it is not hard for us to imagine how strong the feeling is for people on both sides of Panmunjom. Of course, we all know that there exist many obstacles to the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Number one, sequela of the Cold War. Number two, psychological gulf caused by war and long-time separation. Number three, different political system. And number four, differences in economic development. Number five, influence and interaction of major countries. To overcome the above obstacles, efforts should be made in the following aspects by both the North and South, as well as other members of the six-party talks. First, I think the most important thing is to restart the six-party talk. Negotiation is the only way out, not only for Korean Peninsula, but also for anywhere that is troubled by confrontation. And the second is give up Cold War mentality and take practical steps to build mutual trust. And the third is to open door for people's exchange, starting from a mechanism for family reunion. After all, this is one people, and they share the same language, the same culture, and more importantly, the same blood. And number 4 is economic development and cooperation. And the 5th, give the Korean culture a full play in the process of reunification. And 6th, surrounding countries, US, China, Japan, and Russia should also work together to achieve the goal of denuclearization and peace and the stability of the peninsula, and thus promote the steps of reunification. Ladies and gentlemen, the current situation of the Korean peninsula is a legacy of history. To solve this problem, it also takes a historical point of view. A famous Chinese novel, 三国演义, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, begins like this. The world under heaven, after a long period of division, tends to unite. And after a long period of union, tends to divide. The peninsula has been divided for long enough, and the world has changed. It is time to stop confrontation and come back to negotiation table. There will be a way out, and there will be a solution. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
谢谢 Mr. Wang. I especially liked the 三国演义 quotations, the romances of the Three Kingdoms. Many Koreans are very well aware of the famous story about the three countries, the long past of the Chinese history. The time for unification rather than time for division. Let me move on to Mr. Strokhan from Russia. Strokhan, who represents the 콘퍼런스1, the publishing house. Mr. Strokhan.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, colleagues, before coming to the subject, let me thank our hosts for giving us such a rare opportunity to exchange views on one of the most hot potato issues of international politics. I think all of us have to agree that in the world there are journalist unions and associations who are doing nothing. There are unions and associations which are doing wrong things. And there are really journalist associations which are really doing an excellent job, and I think that this is completely relevant to our hosts who gathered us here just to exchange views on the Korean problem. Then, getting back to the issue of our discussion, let me start by saying that the situation on the Korean Peninsula and major security concerns which are emanating from that dangerous standoff between North and Eastern Korea has become a subject of ongoing debate. And in fact, those debates are involving generations of political and public figures, experts and political pundits, not only in vast Asia-Pacific region, but far beyond. Those discussions are often seen as the war of words or heated rhetoric between the parties involved, and they have already kick-started in early 50s. So it means that, how many? Nearly more than 60 years ago. So, but again, the question is how it was 20, 30 years back, what to do with the Korean crisis. And today it has already fitted into the security agenda of the 21st century. We have to acknowledge that international efforts which are aimed at bringing North Korean hermit state to negotiating table and making it to abandon weapons of mass destruction were never a diplomatic picnic. That was really an uphill battle, and it was a bumpy road, full of breathtaking zigzags and diplomatic turnarounds. We know that the pendulum was widely swinging from one side to another. And in fact, we have to acknowledge that very modest success has been achieved so far. And it was largely overshadowed by muscle flexing, military drills, which were seen by the major influence on the West as a source of deterrence for the North. We see that, as I said, this was the case 40, 30, 20 years ago, and with Kim ruling dynasty in North Korea, showing powerful survival instinct, and with no signs that that bizarre neo-Stalinist state will eventually collapse due to its mounting socio-economic problems, six-party diplomacy will look like a futile exercise or a cat-and-mouse play. Doesn't mean that we have to abandon six-party talks. Of course not. For simple reason that we are living in the increasingly interdependent world, and we should understand that while this audience, probably people are some from distant areas, not like we Russians who are neighboring the Korean Peninsula, but if something bad happens in the North Korean Peninsula, let us keep fingers crossed that it will never happen, but still, so it will backlash and no one would remain intact. Again, we have to ask the question, why such an efforts, diplomatic efforts, which are heavily invested in this North Korean crisis, have brought such modest result? What is the problem for that? What is the root for that? To answer that question, to try to unwrap that Korean riddle, or rather untie the Korean knot, one must understand the very nature of that nuclear gamble which has been staged for the last decades involving North Korean successive leaders, because that was the case with Kim's grandfather, that was the case with Kim father, and now this is the case with Kim son. So all of us have to acknowledge plain truth. All hopes that emerged of the young pragmatic North Korean leader who would adopt conciliatory stand towards the West and start his reset policy with South Korea so far have failed. This is the reality. This is very, very sad reality. And we understood that last spring. Probably some of you were here when this conference took place. Actually, it coincided with escalating Korean crisis. It was in last April. And some people were just thinking of whether even to travel to conference because they were taking the advices probably not to come here for the security concern. So that probably was an acid test to see what sort of new leader North Korea got and what sort of a reset we can get from him. But while a lot of is said about North Korean nuclear weapons as a sort of, strategic deterrence on the part of the West, as young North Korean leaders said, the one who has nuclear baton would never, in his hand, would never be attacked. But let me focus just on a less known, probably, reason for North Korea to acquire that nuclear weapons. I believe, as a journalist who is writing on North Korean affairs for more than 20 years, I believe that for North Koreans, this is something more than just weapons of mass destruction. This is a sort of their strategic commodity which they sell to the world. Let me elaborate on that. So each country has its own commodity. Well, Russia is famous for its oil and gas. Say Germany is famous for its cars. Japanese and South Koreans are famous for their IT software. This is their commodity. So North Korea's strategic commodity is threat. They are selling their threat to the world. If they need some foodstuff, if they need rice, if they need oil for their power generators, they just provoke the world to sit together, to think, oh, what to do with North Korea? Let us give them something. And then South Korea is getting that, and for the time being, it is showing restraint. Then again, it is blackmailing the world. It's keep on blackmailing the world, selling it the assets of its threat. And this is very bad. And this practice should be stopped once and for all, because if we see this practice to prevail, then this six-party talk would be just some useless exercise which at utmost can give temporary solution, but not the permanent solution of the North Korean crisis. And the second thing is that when we speak about the logic of North Korea, why it doesn't want to abandon nuclear weapons. So apart of that nuclear baton, which I said in its hands to threaten the neighbor, apart from attempts of just selling the threat to the world, there's also one reason which also is rooted in the very idea of the Chukche idea, which is, so to say, socialism with North Korean face. Some call North Korea just as sort of an offspring of Stalinism, which is both yes and right and wrong, yes and no. Yes, it looks like a bizarre 21st century gulag, but at the same time, North Korea, unlike Stalinist state, which was internationalist and which idea was to impose those model to other countries, for North Korea, it's very more important to stick to its national roots, how they understand this. And that idea of acquiring weapons of mass destruction is well fitting into that idea of Chukche, which was spelled out in the books of the fathers of Korean state. You may read the book of Kim Chen-il, Kim Il-sung. So this explains why they will fight tooth and nail not to allow them to abandon nuclear weapons, and why this really remains an uphill battle. And the final thing, what I want to say, that we should not be illusioned to think that we can allow ourselves, afford ourselves to understand that North Korean crisis, security crisis, can be taken isolated. Obviously, it should be taken in the broader context of what's going on in the world and how international diplomacy is trying to handle either major crisis. Well, when you switch on TV, when you see Ukrainian crisis, when you see the crisis in Iraq, you see the crisis in Syria, then and when you see the crippled efforts of international diplomacy, when you see heated rhetoric and war of words between the West and Russia, when you see the West imposing sanctions on Russia, then the result of that can be the disruption of those traditional mechanisms of diplomacy, which can be applied to a North Korean solution. You know now that Russia's relations with the West probably has reached the rock bottom points in decades. I am not in a position to say who is right, who is wrong, to point fingers, but it is quite clear that while United States are trying to lecture Russia, Russia, in return, can try to handicap American efforts in this or that region. And as a result of that, Korean solution can fall hostage to that gamble of great powers. And this is also very bad. That's why we have to understand that, again, as I said, we are living in the increasingly interdependent world. So we should not be illusioned that if we don't have proper cooperation on Syria or on Iraq, on Iran, all of a sudden we will see a harmony and efforts of all international diplomacy speaking in one voice on Korean crisis. And let me finish this with the observation that the existence and behavior of North Korea is probably a grim reminder to all of us here that we should not be involved in zero-sum games, but rather unite our efforts in meeting major threats and challenges of our times. We should never forget that North Korea state is still standing on the top of the list of the homework to be done by all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for the very stimulating and insightful presentation on the Russian view on the Korean Peninsula and the future of the denuclearization. Let me introduce Mr. Simon Mundy, who joined us a little late. Mr. Simon Mundy is a South and North Korea correspondent. You cover two countries. From the Financial Times, the United States. Sorry?
United Kingdom.
Oh, United Kingdom, sorry.
Oh, yes,
sorry, United Kingdom. He worked for the Financial Times in Johannesburg in South Africa, and then also worked as a company's reporter in London, and was appointed as Financial Times correspondent in Seoul in July 2012. Please welcome Mr. Simon Mundy. Ladies and gentlemen. Let me move on to the Japanese perspective on the issue that we're dealing with in Korea. Ms. Tanaka Miya from the Kyodo News from Japan. Ms. Tanaka. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miya Tanaka from a Japanese news agency called Kyodo News. I appreciate the opportunity to give a talk on this important topic. As you can see from my biography, I'm not an expert on issues regarding the Korean Peninsula. Over the past 3 years, I have been devoting most of my time covering Japan's energy policy after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster. So given the scope and complexity of the issue we are discussing here today, my presentation will only be able to scratch the surface. Still, I hope you will find some of the points I make useful. And I also want to remind you that what I speak here does not represent my company's stance. I want to change this slide. As a Japanese reporter, I would like to focus on Japan's perspective. I would like to start my presentation by explaining how Japan sees the current security landscape of the Asia-Pacific region. After that, I would like to talk about the Japanese government's basic stance toward North Korea and move on to how Japan has reacted to North Korea's nuclear and missile issues. I would also like to touch on some recent developments regarding Japan and North Korea ties. In the end, I would like to make some proposals on how to achieve the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. Now let me go on to the main parts. First, how does Japan see the current security environment of the Asia-Pacific region? The government has often described the situation as becoming increasingly severe, calling North Korea's development of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles a clear and present danger. In the latest version of Japan's white paper on defense, the government has said it assesses North Korea's ballistic missile development has entered a new phase, as the launch of a missile in December 2012, which North Korea called a satellite, showed that North Korea has advanced its technologies to extend the range and improve the accuracy of ballistic missiles. As North Korea has also conducted nuclear tests, the Japanese government has said in a separate document released in December last year that it cannot rule out the possibility that North Korea has successfully miniaturized nuclear weapons for warheads and equipped them on ballistic missiles. Based on such recognitions of the current situation, Japan, as a member of the six-party talks, has been calling on North Korea to abandon all nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs. But what makes Japan's position complicating in the six-party talks is that the government has placed great importance on resolving the issue of the past abduction of Japanese nationals by North Korean agents. The Japanese government has usually used this long sentence to explain its basic stance toward North Korea. Please allow me to read it out. Japan seeks to normalize its relationship with North Korea through comprehensively resolving outstanding issues of concern, including the abduction, nuclear and missile issues, and settling the unfortunate past. To put it shortly, the ultimate goal is the normalization of diplomatic ties between Japan and North Korea. But to achieve that, Japan wants nuclear and missile issues to be resolved together with the abduction issue. This policy is based on the so-called Pyongyang Declaration adopted in 2002, when then-Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi made a landmark visit to Pyongyang for talks with then-North Korea Kim Jong-il. In the declaration, the leaders also agreed that establishing a fruitful political, economic, and cultural relationship between Japan and North Korea would greatly contribute to the peace and stability of the region. So now we have seen that there are three keywords in Japan's basic policy toward North Korea, which is the abduction issue, nuclear and missile issues, and what is known as the settlement of the unfortunate past. Let me talk through the points one by one. As for the abduction issue, this has remained a central sticking point in normalizing ties with North Korea. This is a very emotional issue for Japanese people. Please take a look at this picture. Her name is Yokota Megumi, and she is an iconic victim of North Korea's abduction. She went missing at age 13 while walking home from school in 1977. The Japanese government officially lists 17 nationals as victims of abduction by North Korea in the 1970s and 1980s, and it also suspects Pyongyang's involvement in many more disappearances. North Korea admitted in 2002 to having abducted 13 Japanese nationals, claiming that 8 of them, including Megumi, have died. 5 of the 17 were repatriated in 2002. Japan has demanded North Korea return all the victims and provide a full account, but North Korea has insisted that the issue has already been settled. Although the situation appeared to have been in deadlock, recent developments have raised hopes for some progress in the abduction issue. I will explain about the recent moves later and go on to another keyword I have mentioned in Japan's basic policy toward North Korea, which is the settlement of the unfortunate past. Unfortunate past is a reference to Japan's 1910 to 1945 colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has called on Japan to compensate for the suffering of the Korean people under the colonial rule, and Japan has maintained that economic cooperation will be implemented after the normalization of relations. Now let's see how Japan responded to North Korea's nuclear and missile issues. Japan has strongly condemned North Korea's nuclear tests and launches of ballistic missiles, saying that there are clear violations of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. Aside from UN-led punishment of North Korea over its nuclear and missile activities, Japan has unilaterally imposed sanctions on the movement of items, people, and money. For example, unilateral sanctions include a total ban on imports and exports from and to North Korea, as well as a ban on port entries of North Korean vessels. Japan has also placed importance on cooperating with the United States and South Korea to urge North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. But as I have mentioned earlier, there have been some recent developments regarding the abduction issue a few weeks ago, and it is feared that this may affect the unity of the three countries. Following a meeting between senior Japanese and North Korean officials in Stockholm between May 26 and 28, the two countries announced that North Korea has agreed to reinvestigate the abductions in return for Japan lifting some of its unilateral sanctions. Such moves have raised concerns that Japan may put aside North Korea's nuclear and missile issues as talks to resolve the abduction issue advance, and that by easing sanctions, it would allow international pressure on North Korea to weaken. The Japanese government has emphasized that it will continue to promote cooperation with the United States and South Korea, but careful handling will be required so that easing sanctions ahead of other countries would not drive a wedge between the three countries. In the end, I would like to move on to the final agenda item, the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. First and foremost, I think enhancing dialogue between the two Koreas is essential. The two countries have inter-Korean cooperation projects such as an industrial zone in North Korea's border city of Kaesong and reunions of families separated by the 1950 to 1953 Korean War. But such dialogue has been susceptible to the political situation, so I think it is important to explore ways to ensure that such cross-border communications will not be interrupted by the political situation as much as possible. I also think neighboring countries should work to create a stable and peaceful regional environment to encourage such inter-Korean dialogue. So what kind of role can Japan play in this process? Can Japan ever become something like a mediator or facilitator? So far, I think the Japanese government has been more focused on seeking to play its part to achieve North Korea's denuclearization and doesn't have a clear vision or a roadmap on how it plans to engage in the unification process. Therefore, I think Japan must first start by discussing with related parties in and outside the country about the possible role the country can play. At the same time, Japan should make further efforts to achieve the normalization of ties with North Korea and also build trustful relations with other neighboring countries, which have often been soured by disputes over historical and territorial issues. But I do feel these issues are not easy to overcome. Efforts at the grassroots level will also be important. I think the government should encourage efforts to deepen understanding of the situation on the Korean Peninsula, such as by creating more opportunities for Japanese people to study the past and think about the future relationship between Japan and the two Koreas. So I guess that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Tanaka, for the very succinct and articulate presentation on the Japanese view on the Korean Peninsula. Let me move on to Mr. Simon Mundy. Would you like to give us your view, the British view, Financial Times view on the Korean Peninsula? Thank you, Mr. Mundy.
안녕하십니까? Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. The division of Korea was one of the saddest events of the Cold War. It resulted from the global strategic contest between the US and the Soviet Union, and it was something that Korean people were powerless to prevent. With every year that's passed, the prospect of unification has come to appear more and more challenging. After nearly 7 decades of division, I think it's totally unclear how Korean reunification can be achieved. And I'm sorry to say this, but in my opinion, there is no meaningful possibility that the current North Korean regime will agree to peaceful reunification. From everything that I've heard over the last 2 years, it seems very clear that Kim Jong-un and his inner circle would fear losing everything they have in that event, and quite possibly imprisonment or even death. So sadly, I believe that Korean reunification could be achieved only by the overthrow of the Kim regime. I want to say at this point, I'm not calling for regime change, and I'm certainly not advocating murder, but I think any serious analyst of North Korea has to consider the following as contingent possibilities. So the first, and again I should stress I'm not supporting this, but the first would presumably come through the assassination of the Supreme Leader. I imagine this would happen either by a lone member of his inner circle, as happened with the assassination of the South Korean President Park Chung-hee, or perhaps through a high-level plot, as with the attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler in 1944. There are, I think, signs of division and dissent at the highest level of the North Korean state, and something we haven't seen for decades, since the time of Kim Il-sung, the execution of Kim Jong-un's uncle and top advisor, Jang Song-taek, clearly showed that whether because of paranoia or perceptiveness, Kim feels unable to trust even those who are closest to him in government. A reliable source recently told me about a regime official who was making extremely disparaging, insulting remarks about Kim in private conversation with a foreign visitor. The second way that regime change could happen in North Korea would be through a popular uprising. I think this is highly unlikely in the short term, because I've never heard of any kind of meaningful civil society in North Korea. But one thing that makes me see that as an outside possibility in the long term is my conversations with North Korean defectors here in South Korea, and the difference between what I've heard from people who left in the 1990s and people who left over the last 10 and especially the last 5 years. So people who left in the 1990s, if I ask, did you believe all the North Korean propaganda, they always say, well, of course, because we had nothing else to believe. We had no other information. And when I ask why they left, they normally left because the economic situation was so desperate, or because they had got into trouble with the authorities. And there's a big difference with people who have left more recently. They always tell me they didn't trust the propaganda, They were so exposed to information from the outside world, in particular the South Korean TV dramas, movies, from China also. These are smuggled in on DVDs or flash drives. And when I ask these people, why did you leave? It's a very different answer. They say, I wanted to be free. I wanted to decide my own life. I didn't want to have my life and my career chosen for me by the government from birth till death. We should remember also that most North Koreans no longer rely on the state for their survival, as was the case in the past. People find food and other necessities, consumer goods, largely through private trade. So all this suggests to me that the chances of a popular uprising have increased since around 1990. I think the chances are very low in the near term, but we shouldn't write it off altogether. Now, even if the Kim regime falls, and that could still be decades away, I don't think Korean reunification is guaranteed by any means. People with knowledge of Chinese government thinking on this subject have told me there is extreme nervousness in Beijing, at least among many people there, about the prospect of Korean reunification. China seems to worry that reunified Korea could mean a powerful ally of the US right on China's border, and this would add to China's very public fears about encirclement by the US. And this might give China a possible incentive to support a new regime in North Korea that would preserve North Korean independence. And to be honest, I think we should actually question whether any of the states that participated in the six-party talks have reason to be enthusiastic about Korean reunification. China worries that a unified Korea would be a US ally, but I think it would also be reasonable for Washington to fret that a unified Korea would no longer see such a need for the very close alliance with the US that Seoul now has. China is clearly already a far more important economic partner for Korea, and Korea might easily decide, a unified Korea might decide that it would no longer be appropriate for the US to have forces stationed in the country. And this would clearly undermine the pivot to Asia that has become a fundamental part of US foreign policy. Russia has been developing closer ties with North Korea, including access to its ports, and this might be complicated by Korean unification. Japan has very difficult relationships with both North and South Korea and might be intimidated by the prospect of their unification. And frankly, I think we must also question the strength of the South Korean commitment to unification. This is something that has recently been reaffirmed by the South Korean government. Park Geun-hye has put a lot of stress on her 통일 대박, unification bonanza slogan. The language here is very interesting. 대박 is really a slang word that's usually used by youngsters and not by politicians. So obviously this slogan is aimed at the youth. Why? Because President Park knows that many, and perhaps even most, young South Koreans are actually actively opposed to the idea of reunification. That's largely because, or mostly because of concerns about the cost. Unlike many older people, I think most young people have no personal connection with anyone in the North and feel less of a personal connection with the people of that country. President Park has sought to address these concerns by stressing the economic benefits of unification. And these would stem largely from North Korea's natural resources and cheap labor. This argument clearly has unfortunate echoes of European colonial projects. And moreover, I think young people are very skeptical about the president's logic, and their skepticism is probably justified. In the long term, there might be some economic benefits to unification, but in the short term, it would clearly be extremely expensive, with costs running into hundreds of billions of dollars. Raising necessary funds would only be one part of the government's challenge. A key priority must be to prevent a situation where several million North Koreans flood into the south seeking work. This would severely damage South Korean sentiment towards the unification project, and one can easily imagine a situation with squatter camps springing up, crime increasing, low-skilled South Korean workers losing their jobs to cheaper South Korean and North Korean labor. The standard response to this problem is to say that reunification would be achieved through a gradual process over many years. But it is not clear to me that this would be possible to achieve. What would the government do if 1 million North Korean people march on the border demanding equal rights as Korean citizens? The focus then would have to be on massive-scale investment in North Korea that would give its people the incentive to stay north of the border. Private companies might be willing to provide much of this investment, but it seems inevitable that a huge amount of South Korean public funds would be required. And I'm afraid there is no indication that South Korean people are willing to fund these enormous costs. There was a recent poll by the Asan Institute here in Seoul, and that showed that the majority of respondents were not willing to pay even $100 in extra taxes to fund unification. So as she outlines her Tongil-Debak project, President Park must hope that the immediate prospect of reunification, if and when the opportunity arises, would fundamentally transform the widespread apathy towards the idea that we see at the moment. But with every year that passes, and as memories of a unified Korea become dimmer and dimmer, the challenges becomes ever more forbidding. I'm sorry if these remarks sound unduly gloomy. Needless to say, I hope very deeply that I will one day see a unified Korea, but I think it's best for all parties in this debate to be totally honest and frank about their opinions when discussing what may prove one of the most difficult political projects of modern history. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Simon Mundy, for your very interesting view and also very intriguing view about the unification and the future of the North Korean regime. Perhaps we can come back to all the points that were presented in the session. The last presenter in this panel is Mr. Lee Ha-won from TV Chosun. As I mentioned, he was working for Chosun-ilbo for a long time and a former correspondent in Washington, D.C., and now he's editing the TV Chosun program. Mr. Lee.
Can I make a presentation sitting in this chair? Yeah.
Sure.
I'm comfortable with this desk. Thank you for having me. It is a great honor to participate in this privileged conference, especially where I have never thought that I'm in the same table with Congressman Jim Park. So this is a great honor to be here under the moderation of Congressman Jim Park. Rather than focusing on the unification, I would like to focus on the North Korea's imminent threat, weapons of mass destruction, the North Korean nuclear issues. I am one of the South Korean journalists who had been to Beijing to cover six-party talks. Most six-party talks started in 2003 August. So from that time on, before I was assigned in Washington, D.C. in 2007, almost every time, whenever the six-party talks were held in Beijing, I was there to cover the six-party talks. So I would like to talk about this issue based on my experience. Or my conclusion covering the six-party talks is a failed system, and it is, I believe that it is the right time to think about the other system besides the six-party talks. North Korea is very smart to use these six-party talks, and North Korea, in one hand, while they're having their talks with South Korea, Japan, and United States, China, and Russia, they use the time to develop their highly enriched uranium. So in 2008, the December, the last six-party talks were held, and at that time, North Korea announced that we are now having the HEU, highly enriched uranium material. That means for from 2003 to 2008, the six-party talks dealt with the only platinum-based North Korean nuclear development program, North Korean nuclear program. But for I guess that they started to developed the HEU from the early 20th century, 2000, probably 2000 or 2001. They used the time to make the HEU. So for our last, I think, 6 years, the six-party talks were stalled, and North Korea, they are now having two programs. One is a platinum-based nuclear weapons program, and the other is highly enriched uranium program. So I believe that it now the other 5 countries try to focus on to resolve the North Korean nuclear problems instead of having just the restart of having the nuclear, the six-party talks. And secondly, I'd like to talk about, raise this issue with regards to the China and United States, the cooperation. In my conclusion, I think the cooperation between the G2 is really important to resolve North Korean nuclear problem. But until now, I don't think those two countries are realizing the significance of resolving this issue, and they are not having the unilateral system. And especially, I'd like to talk about China. China is the chair country of the six-party talks. But when I went to the Beijing to cover six-party talks, where, in my opinion, I thought that the Chinese government just tried to enjoy the six-party talks rather than resolving this issue. So I am having some expectation after the Chinese new leader Xi Jinping became the president. I found that Chinese leader Xi Jinping realized the significance of this issue right after North Korea had the third nuclear test last year, February 12. So I think thanks to the Chinese President Xi Jinping, the North Korea is afraid of having the first nuclear test. So it is the right time for China and the United States to think about the unilateral system and the unilateral kind of the method to resolve this issue. So in conclusion, my suggestion is rather than trying to have six-party talks, I don't like to say that the six-party talks is useless. But the six-party talks is a failed system, so this is the right time to think about the new system, and I think maybe this venue is one of the opportunity to talk about the new system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Well, we have a presentation by 5 distinguished panelists, each with their own views on various issues involved. What I'm going to do now is to kickstart our discussion by raising several questions to the panelists before I open the floor for the public discussion on the issue. Maybe I can start with Mr. Lee, the backwards. I would like to put brief questions to each of the panelists, and then I'll give you some time to think it over, and then we will get the answers from the panelists and then move on to the public discussion. Mr. Lee Ha-won, as you have rightly described, the six-party talks has its internal problems because, as the Korean saying goes, it looks like the countries in the six-party talks are in the same bed, but with different dreams. For example, in the case of South Korea, we think that we can play the most important role to persuade the North to denuclearize and to move towards opening and reform by the North Korean regime. And that will help the prospects for the denuclearization. So from South Korean viewpoint, inter-Korean relationship is the most important element in trying to solve this problem. because we are direct parties concerned to the North Korean nuclear problem, whereas China and maybe North Korea seem to think that perhaps the relation between North Korea and the United States would be the most important variable in the solution to the problem, because North Korea keeps arguing that they are nuclear power. We already have the nuclear deterrent. And we want to talk about nuclear disarmament with the United States. And the United States may think that the relationship between China and North Korea would be very important to solve this problem, because China can exercise influence on North Korea to move away from nuclearization and take the choice of the opening and reform. So it looks like, given this internal discord or the different dreams of the six-party talks members, as Mr. Lee has said, it'll be very difficult to resume the momentum for six-party talks. And you said the new system might have to be invented, created, to continue our international efforts to denuclearize North Korea. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Lee, what kind of new systems are you thinking about? Is this some sort of a new structuring of the six-party talks, or the addition of the members from other countries, or something? No, you don't have to answer now, but I just will give you some time to think about it. Just elaborate on your new systems for the six-party talks as an alternative approach to solve this problem. Let me ask a question to Mr. Strauss-Kahn here about the Russian view of the unification. You emphasized the threats, the threat for food and the threat for negotiations and the weapons of mass destruction strategy to put pressure on other countries to make concession to North Korea. I mean, this problem keeps repeating itself, and that's the most important and difficult aspects of dealing with North Korea. Now, I remember that 2-3 years ago, eMemo, the Russian think tank for world economy and international relations, published a report, 2011, I think, 3 years ago, about year 2030. And that was reported in the Korean media as well, because it contained the section on Korean Peninsula. If I remember correctly, the report from Russia said Korean Peninsula will be reunited between 2011 to 2030. So it'll be like a 2 decades process. And secondly, economic integration will happen during the 2020s, which is about 6-7 years from now on. And the third point is that the Korean unification by the leadership of South Korea will bring benefit to Russia. So I was very struck by the very straightforward perspective put by the Russian think tank about the future unification of Korea and the impact or the benefit it'll bring to Russia. I would like to ask you, Mr. Strauss-Kahn, whether this is a kind of prevailing view in Russia, or is this a minority view, or do you think that perhaps there might be other views on Korean unification? So I'll give you a chance to think about it. Please
reunification, yeah?
Reunification.
Well, yeah, but before answering, can I just 30 seconds as a follow-up to what Mr. Lee said over that?
Yeah, I'll give you a chance. I'll give you a chance.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
no, excuse me.
Okay,
I'll give you a chance.
Okay.
Not right, not now. So, later. I'll give you enough time to respond.
I put down then the question,
Okay.
not to forget.
And to Mr. Simon Mundy, as your presentation is very stimulating and very exciting. In your presentation, you mentioned that China is quite nervous about the prospect of reunification of the Korean Peninsula, because it worries that reunified Korea would mean a powerful ally of the United States, and the fears of encirclement by the U.S. At the same time, you also mentioned that U.S. is also concerned about the possibility that unified Korea will see no further need for close alliance with the U.S. that Seoul now has. Maybe we need some public opinion polls in this country about what kind of foreign policy the unified Korea might want to have. But my question is that I was recently struck by the speech by one Japanese professor scholar from Tsinghua University in Korea, Mr. Chu Shulong, who mentioned in his paper that the future of North Korea remains very uncertain, it's troublesome and dangerous. And South Korea will continue to be rising on the Korean Peninsula in terms of economic disparity between two Koreas. The gap will grow. And he said Korean unification might take place in future decades, in several decades' time. And many Chinese believe, he said, that North Korea cannot last too long. And it would fail sometime in the future. I mean, you can call it a regime failure or regime collapse. Then the Korean Peninsula would be united and China would welcome such a unification because it would be in the interest of China to see that Korean Peninsula will be unified. How do you interpret this argument by a Chinese scholar? Perhaps this is not a mainstream view in China, but this kind of perspectives are emerging in China. Do you think that this could signify some kind of changing perception in China about North Korea or the future of the Korean unification or something else? I'll be very interested in listening to your comments on this issue. Next, I would like to ask a question to Ms. Tanaka Miya, whose presentation I enjoyed it very much, very clear-cut and very articulate. You mentioned the May 26 agreement between Japan and North Korea about the resumption of the examination of the abductees, the people who are missing in North Korea, the Japanese who are missing in North Korea. The numbers of these missing people, abducted people, are different between two sides, and it is a task of North Korea to prove that they are either dead or still alive, or there are remains of these abductees. Now, regarding this newly resumed dialogue, negotiations between Japan and Korea, there are two different perspectives I noticed in the international media. That one is that this could lead to some sort of a new possibility for North Korea kind of opening up towards other countries. In this case is Japan. And Japan certainly has the economic means to provide economic assistance to North Korea, which is now kind of pinched by the UN sanctions. But at the same time, there are potential concerns about the implications of the resumption of the dialogue between Japan and North Korea about its discord or potential conflict with a continuing regime of the UN international sanctions on North Korea. What if Japan agrees to open its doors with North Korea based on some progress and the abductees issue and starts to provide economic assistance to North Korea? Would that be in line with the UN-sponsored sanction by the UN Security Council? I would be interested in listening your view, Ms. Tanaka, on the implication of this issue. And Mr. Wang, your presentation, I think, is quite straightforward, that China would see that the Korean unification will happen, and also it'll be desirable in the future. But in the meantime, there are obstacles to the reunification of the peninsula because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I was very interested in the second item, which is psychological gulf caused by war and long-time separation, a kind of dissimulation between two Koreas because of the long separation and under different ideology. And in fact, President Park Geun-hye has mentioned these aspects of the reunification. In her Dresden speech in East Germany, former East Germany, that she would like to bring the two societies together and promote some kind of an assimilation between the two sides. It'll require financial assistance and some kind of a psychological mutual understanding of the difference of the social cultural aspects of two Koreas. And your recommendation is that we should give the Korean culture a full play in the process of reunification. Can you explain further how you can enlarge the room for cultural assimilation or cultural role to play in the process of the reunification? And related to this question is the Chinese average netizens' view of North Korea. You have hundreds of millions of Chinese netizens looking and watching the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and I guess there are a growing number of those who are interested in the future unification issue. What is the general view, or have you noticed any change in the tones of the Chinese netizens in looking towards the Korean issue, especially after the execution of the Jang Sung-taek, the sudden execution of the second most powerful man in North Korea, who happens to be the main intermediary of the transaction between China and North Korea? What kind of impact do you think it had on the public view, the Chinese public view, the netizens' view towards North Korea? So I'll give you some time to think, and I'll start with Mr. Lee Ha-won. Mr. Lee.
Yeah, I'd like to make it clear that I'm not opposing the six-party talks. I'm not saying that six-party talks is useless. I am talking to you that we need to think about and talk about besides the six-party talks to expedite, to resolve the North Korean nuclear crisis. Actually, six-party talks can be used as a kind of a great mechanism, like the NATO in Europe and the ARF in the Asian Regional Forum in ASEAN. So besides, as I mentioned, I wish I had a good idea to replace or to supplement six-party talks. But at least I'd like to suggest one thing, that is so-called strategic triangle dialogue between South Korea and China and the United States. The reason why I am suggesting this kind of system is Chinese government is opposing the five-party talks besides, except the North Korea. South Korea and the United States tried to have a five-party talks to discuss this issue, because North Korea, they said that the six-party talks is no longer valuable. So we are not participating in the six-party talks anymore. So South Korea tried to have South Korea and United States tried to have a five-party talks, but it never been convened. So I think, as I mentioned, the Chinese role is really important. And actually, the North Korean nuclear crisis is not only issue of South Korea. I think that is the very dangerous issue for Chinese. For example, in South Korea, there are 1.6 million foreigners in Korea, and half of them are Chinese. Where most of them are ethnic Koreans, but the nationality is the Chinese, so-called Joseonjo. So in South Korea, at least 700,000 Chinese are living here. So if something happened to Korean Peninsula, I think that is the very serious issue of Chinese. And think about what happened in the radiation leak is made in Yongbyon area. They can go to the northeast area of the Chinese. So I think China should bear the stakeholder and in this issue, and having that kind of strategic triangle dialogue among United States and China and South Korea, I think we can make the unilateral method and the principle to deal with North Korea. The reason why I am talking about the China so much, because this is the World Conference and we are talking about six-party talks, because the Chinese government has a lot of method to make up pressure on North Korea. For example, I'm not sure how you are familiar with this issue. There are only one the gas pipe only one gas pipe is going to North Korea just through the China. So just the Chinese government just cut off 1 week or 2 weeks. I don't think North Korea can survive. And very recently, there are some reports that the Chinese government, they were really upset by North Korea's third nuclear test last year. So for a short time, they cut off their supplying gas. So I think the China and United States and South Korea should have their strategic, a kind of a strategic triangle dialogue. Thank you.
Mr. Lee, so you would argue that this six-party talk, despite its internal problems and deficiencies, should be able to be resumed by the six-party members, and the China should play a more proactive role?
Yes, I really wish the six-party talks would be held anytime, and I don't oppose of having talks in six-party talks.
All right. Next, Mr. Strokan. Sorry to keep you from talking, but please, you have the time.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up to that controversy of the six-party talks, whether it is obsolete or not, what Mr. Lee was just given some thought-provoking observations. Well, what came to my mind is that I think we can compare it to the Iranian crisis. Look, we had two major international security crises, North Korean and Iranian. And with Iran, we had also mechanism of six-party talks. And with North Korea, we also had a mechanism of six-party talks. I remember when President Ahmadinejad was in power in Iran, there was a lot of talk, a lot of cynicism among political pundits, expert community, journalists who were saying, what are they doing in Geneva? What they're doing in Vienna? These six-party talks in Istanbul, because they were changing the venue. Six-party talks on Iran. This is just for opportunities. This is just dissemination of useless press releases. And then all of a sudden, we realized that six-party talks, when it came to Iran, which was considered to be just something very ineffective, all of a sudden has started to give results. What was the reason for that? The reason for that was, again, surprise change of wind in Tehran, the election of moderate Iranian President Rouhani, and which proved to be more conciliatory, more cooperative, which understood that they have to get more from cooperation with the West rather than just threatening it, blackmailing it. I think that Iranian example is very relevant to understanding our situation with that North Korean crisis. Relevant for two reasons. First, it shows that unless there are major changes inside the country, like it happened in Iran, you can't expect diplomacy to succeed, whether it is two-party talk or three-party talk or four-party talk or eight-party talk or six-party talk. So we have to wait for some changes to be introduced in North Korea. And then we will realize that the problem is not the very mechanism of six-party talks. Not the problem is that probably there are not experienced diplomats involved in that. But the problem is the situation inside the country, which seems to be the major troublemaker. This is the first thing. One other thing is practical thing regarding the mechanism of six-party talks. As you remember, as today at the lunch, Mr. Vice Minister said that we don't need talk for the sake of talk. We don't need six-party talk for the sake of six-party talk. We need some result. And probably this also sends us a sort of a signal to understand in what way to evolve the mechanism of six-party talk. The mechanism as such should exist because we can't invent something else. But obviously, six-party talks needs a sort of fine-tuning of its policy. To put it more bluntly, we should not allow anymore North Korea, as I said, to blackmail the world, to use six-party talk as an instrument of just selling its threat, you see, and getting something, then again going to its hermit state condition, and then again blackmailing it. So if this system prevails, then of course this would be really obsolete, useless mechanism of six-party talks, but it can change. And I think that what should be the primary task of these six-party talks, to make North Korea to inch to changes. What Simon was saying, that dwelling on what defectors are saying, that what was in the 90s now, even in those people who live in Korea, they also acknowledge that there are some changes. So everything in this world is changing, and North Korea is not an exception. So six-party talks should gently move North Korea to change gently, because you know how they are reacting in any strong harsh moves. So I don't think that strong instruments would work on them. And regarding your question over the Russia and Russia's position on the reunification, yes, do I get it right? Yeah, of two Koreans. Well, I'm not a spokesman of Russian foreign minister, as you understand. I'm not spokesman of Kremlin. I represent independent paper. But if I were a spokesman of Russian foreign minister, I would say something like this. For Russia, a lot would depend on what would emerge out of the result of this reunification of two Koreas. Russia obviously would welcome the reunification of North Koreans if, first, it would not create security, humanitarian, environmental, and other problems near Russia's Far East borders. Second, if it would provide new opportunities for the development of Russia's Far East and Siberia. Third, if this newly emerging Korean state would have neutral status, it would not be part of any military political alliance. This point is very important because you know that Russia's relations with the West are very bad now. And Russia smells a rat in any move, which is, whatever we see United States are taking in Asia-Pacific and their allies. You know what sort of reaction is coming from Russia when we see regular military drills which are conducted by United States and South Korea. That's why, of course, for Russia, if we give our wild imagination chance just to see that we will have not two Koreas but then one, then of course I'm sure that for Russia neutral status of this state would be one of the primary reasons. If all those points which I mentioned would not work, if the new state would create concerns and problems for Russia's security, if it would not provide opportunities for business, and if the new state would become a part of some web of newly emerging alliances, then of course Russia would say no to such a unification.
Thank you. So, my understanding is that you support Korean reunification with some caveats, like without
the devil is in details.
Okay, so without any negative impacts on the security environment of Russia and the Far Eastern border and so on. So, well, thank you for your frank views. Let me move on to Mr. Simon Mundy.
Thank you. I was a little careless when writing the text of this speech. Fortunately, I corrected myself when reading it. In the written text, I said, China worries. I corrected that to say many in China worry. And that's incredibly important because when it comes to strategic thinking, there is no such thing as China. There are many people with different views. And there's clearly an extreme diversity. I think if we look at the difference within the Chinese government, it seems that the international department of the Chinese Communist Party has typically been more sympathetic to the communist regime in North Korea. The Chinese Foreign Ministry perhaps has tended to be more frustrated with mistakes and provocative behavior by North Korea. I think one really important thing to bear in mind, last year, for example, when North Korea did its nuclear tests, China reacted quite strongly. Xi Jinping made a speech in Hainan saying we will not allow any country to throw this region into chaos, quite clearly rebuking North Korea very publicly. As far as I'm aware, China and North Korea have never been close or affectionate with each other. Mao sent in the volunteers into North Korea not to protect North Korea, but to protect China. I think the Red Guards in China were calling Kim Il-sung a fat revisionist as long ago as the 1960s. So I think there's always been quite a difficult relationship there. My point was, and again, I chose my words quite carefully on this, I'm not saying what the governments of the various countries really think about unification, because I don't know. They wouldn't make the full details public, clearly. But do they have reason to be enthusiastic? I don't think any of them do. From China's point of view, I think there is an element, and thank you for pointing to this very interesting speech. I think the view being expressed here seems to me to be saying we have to get ready because the current system is unsustainable, which I think is true. It's slowly the system that was built up by Kim Il-sung is falling apart. The economic system now is no longer controlled by the state. The ideological system is no longer controlled by the state. It's not sustainable. I think that looking at it from a game theory point of view, if I were the president of China, what would I want if my sole concern was the national interest, which national leaders' concern tends to be? You'd probably actually want North Korea to follow the Chinese example and undertake Chinese reforms. And this is clearly what China has been working on for many years. They insisted on taking Kim Jong-il on tours of Chinese industrial areas in Shenzhen and elsewhere to try to open his eyes and say, look, you can do this in North Korea too. And there have been some efforts in North Korea. You have special economic zones, but I don't think either Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un can really be compared to Deng Xiaoping. So I don't think that the Chinese efforts are really working in the sense of trying to promote reform. So as for what happens now, I think one thing that's really interesting is to notice that Park Geun-hye, South Korean president, did a state visit to Beijing. Xi Jinping is, I believe, preparing a visit to South Korea. Now, Kim Jong-un apparently is not welcome in Beijing. He hasn't been. Xi Jinping doesn't seem to have any intention of going to Pyongyang. We have a South Korean general arriving in Beijing in a military aircraft, which is highly symbolic and a sign of closer military relationships between the two countries that fought against each other some decades ago. So I think there are signs of a very, very close relationship between China and South Korea. Between China and North Korea, I think there's a difficult relationship, as it has always been. I don't think, although it's certainly true that China could cause the economic collapse of North Korea quite easily by cutting off fuel supplies, I don't think they would do that because I think it would be a very rash and risky thing to do, which I don't think I think the Chinese government is too intelligent to do that. But I think certainly China is preparing for the fact that if North Korea doesn't change the way it operates, then eventually it's likely to collapse.
Thank you, Mr. Mundy. I'm sure that this point might come up again in our Q&A session. Let me move on to Ms. Tanaka. Thank you.
I think the question was whether Japan's possible easing of sanctions will basically be in line with the UN Security Council resolution. So far, I think the Japanese government has focused on easing its unilateral sanctions and has not mentioned anything easing about sanctions related to the UN Security Council resolution. So my conclusion is that it is basically in line with the UN Security Council resolutions. And if there is, it depends on the progress, but if there would be any kind of setback, like if North Korea shows signs that there is, it's not keeping its word, I think Japan will put the sanctions back again. So it's going to be Japan will also check the progress. So I think it really depends on the progress, but I don't think Japan is really trying to go so far as to remove is only will only focus on the unilateral sanctions so far, and also Japan is placing importance over the collaboration of the Japan, United States, and South Korea cooperation. So I think it will be really careful not to disrupt the unity of the three countries. And I also think that Japan should take this opportunity to try to flex its diplomatic muscles to not only focus on the abduction issue, but also to draw some concessions on the nuclear and missile issues. And in the recent agreement between Japan and North Korea, it is true that the Japanese government has also said it will consider offering some humanitarian aid depending on the progress, not now, but possibly in the future. But it doesn't really says when, so I think it really, again, that also depends on the progress, and I think Japan will be really careful on making that decision.
Thank you, Ms. Tanaka. May I ask you, what is your view, briefly, on the prospect of the Japan-US-Korea triangular cooperation? We used to have a policy coordination mechanism, which is not working as much as you might want these days because of the strained relationship between Japan and Korea due to history issue and territory issue. What is your view on the value and also the perspective on the importance of the Japan-US-Korea triangle?
Well, I think there are some difficult issues between Japan and South Korea. I think the trilateral cooperation and the importance of it has not changed at all. And I would like to take note that we are having, the two countries are having difficulty in arranging one-on-one talks between the two countries' leaders. And because U.S. President Barack Obama helped us actually to mediate a trilateral talk in The Hague in March, and I think that could be some starting point that highlighted the importance that Japan, South Korea, and the United States should be firmly united against North Korea, and I think we should continue to demonstrate that the three countries will act in unity against North Korea, and I don't think it will be our country's or other countries' national interest that we are seeing that we have some divisions when dealing in North Korea.
Thank you, Ms. Tanaka. Mr. Wang Shenshiong,
Yes.
on the Chinese view on Korean Peninsula and also netizens' perspectives on this.
The psychological gulf, you put forward several questions. Before answering your question, I want to make a very short response to Mr. Lee. You mentioned, you suggested 5-party talks. And suppose I were North Korea, I would say, okay, go ahead, you 5 parties go on talking. I will concentrate on nuclear test. And North Korea is a very, very important role. It's a major role in the entire process. So if they are excluded from the talk, I don't see the possibility of solution of this problem. And the second, your suggestion is the cutting off the gas pipe. It would, in my opinion, it would cause a humanitarian crisis, something like putting oil on fire. That's my opinion. I don't know whether you agree with me or not. And, okay. And now let me come to my answering to the moderator's question. I used the word psychological gulf in my presentation. It is, after all, more than 60 years of separation between the North and the South. And the language and culture may digress to different directions. I don't know Korean languages, but when I watch TV or listen to radio, I could tell the tone of the same language is totally different. And my worry is, as time goes on, the culture may digress to different directions. So it's of key importance for the North and the South to stress on the same thing, the same culture, and bring people together. That's what, in my opinion. And the netizen of China, their impression about the North and the South. I should say that the Chinese netizens' impression about the North is not good. It's bad and worse since the third test. And previously, because the North Korean doesn't have access to internet, there's little interact between the netizens of China and the North Korea. They don't know. But now, I think the attitude toward the country is not good at all. And about the South, I think it is very positive. The attitude is very positive. We have a lot of young people loving Korean TV series. I have a colleague here, Ms. Zhu from China Daily. She is a fan of Lee Min-ho. That's my pronunciation correct, Lee Min-ho.
Lee Min-ho.
Lee Min-ho is a
Lee Min-ho.
TV star.
Yeah.
Okay. And Gangnam Style is very popular in China. And of course, there have been a lot of arguments between Chinese netizens and South Korean netizens, about who is the origin of zongzi, the kind of food commemorating Qu Yuan, the famous poet of China, and about the world cultural heritage, this kind of thing. In my point of view, they argue means they care each other. If they don't argue, just like husband and wife, if they don't argue, they don't quarrel, they separate. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask any panelist to respond to the answers of any panelist towards each other before I open the floor. Mr. Lee.
Yes, I would like to respond to Mr. Wang, and I would like to make a comment with regards to their unification. I didn't say that I'd like to have 5 party talks. The South Korean government and the United States try to have 5 party talks. The main reason of the failure of 6 party talks is the division in 5 party talks, except the North Korea. And without having their one method and one principle, how can it deal with North Korea? So that's why I think that the 5 party should have one principle and one method to deal with the North Korean regime. And secondly, you talk about the gas pipe and with regard and humanitarian issue, where unless even though the North Korean regime is having a supply of the gas, the humanitarian situation in North Korea is the worst in the world. And I don't think the North Korean regime, they are using the gas supply to the North Korean people. They are using the gas for their leading groups. And what I'm talking about, the China is as I mentioned, China has a lot of, the method to make pressure. And many South Koreans think that the Chinese government try to just have a status quo. Chinese favor the divided Korea. So please try to remove this concept if the South Korean think bad. And I think and with regards to the unification, I have no idea why the unified South Korea, the surrounding countries worried about the security or something like that. Think about the history of the East Asia. The Korean Peninsula always became a prey of their strong powers. South Korea never invaded other countries or never tried to, never provoke the other countries. So don't worry about the unified Korea and just try to support the unified Korea. I am talking to the Russian participants.
I'll give you a chance to respond. Okay, Mr. Wang.
Yes. What I want to say is this is also a response to Mr. Mondi. And United Korea could also be an ally of China, not only to the U.S., but also could be. And South Korea I think China is having a very good relation with South Korea. And ally could be military ally, could be culture and economic.
I think I mentioned in my speech that is in turn perhaps the fear of the U.S. that's the unified Korea. I think you could argue that there is reason, because as I said, I don't know exactly what the governments are thinking, but there would be a reason for the US to be worried about Korea allying with China, and also for China to worry about Korea allying
to the US.
With the US. And I think when these things are uncertain, governments tend to go for the devil they know over the devil they don't. And given that in China, for example, the government has so many things it needs to worry about, the Korean unification would just be another very difficult problem to add to the list, which might have positive outcomes, but at the same time, I think governments tend to avoid big strategic issues if they can. So there seems to me to be reasons for China to be nervous.
Any more internal debate? I'm sure that unified Korea will be a good friend of everybody, including Russia.
Yeah.
Mr. Strokan.
Okay. So as we are involved in this debate over the six-party talks, just I want also to add a comment on the role of each of the players in six-party talks, because it seems as we are taken for granted as if it is speaking in one voice, as if it is unanimous group, which unfortunately is not true, and obviously each party has its own hidden agenda. Each party has its own second thoughts over that, and this also complicates already difficult diplomatic process. So what I want to say that we should no party of six-party talks should look at the situation at the Korean Peninsula through the prism of rivalry. Rivalry in Asia-Pacific, whether it is Chinese-American rivalry or Russian-American rivalry, we should not, any party of the talks should not try to get an upper hand over the other parties of the mechanism, because the very nature of six-party talks envisages multilateral mechanism. I remember it was, if I'm not mistaken, the year 2000 when President Putin was going to Okinawa. That was his debut at G8 summit in Okinawa, and he was going, it's very interesting, he was going to Okinawa, making short stopover in Pyongyang, meeting North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who told him that he's abandoning his missile program, and beaming confident Putin, for him it was debut at G8 summit in Okinawa, came and told world leaders, look guys, so I brought good news. North Korea abandoning missile tests. That is, can you imagine, that was 14 years ago. So what I'm saying is that Korean card should never work in the relations between the two parties, and we should not be involved in zero-sum game. This is extremely important. If we don't understand that, that will be a complete mess, and the negotiating process within the framework of six-party talks would be dead.
All right, may I? Yes. Any more internal debate? Any comments or any questions towards each other? We all agree. Okay, so now I'm going to open the floor for public discussion. Please raise your hand, identify yourself, make your question very brief and succinct, and indicate the panelist that you're going to ask question to. The lady in the middle, yes. Would you please bring the microphone to the lady, and then I'll give you the chance second and the third and fourth, yeah. Fifth, yes.
Hi, my name is Kiratikon Naksampop. I'm from Thailand. It's a very interesting agenda, in my opinion. Lots of information, lots of what we think, or what we think they think or they feel, or what we heard or what we know. But what's in it for North Korea? This question addressed to anyone that would like to answer. Maybe it's a naive question, but what's in it for them in North Korea perspective? Because what they have been behaving, they're still receiving aids and people still try to talk to them. So what's in it for them if they try to be nicer, or if they try to look at the reunification with South Korea? Have they talked? And I think that's the first question. And another question is, when you talk about reunification, does North Korea looking at it as become one country? Or maybe just something like United Korea with two identities, that kind of sort of thing? Just wondered. And we haven't seen much of the North Korea leader in any leader conference, any world event. So I believe that as long as we haven't seen much or hear much from them officially, this issue probably would never be resolved or get any moving toward any positive point. Thank you.
All right. Now, you have any specific panelists you would like to, or just a general?
Anyone that would like to answer, but
maybe
should
then,
be someone.
Maybe then I will ask Mr. Lee to
Thank
respond first, if there's anyone. I will just invite you. But can I take the second question? Yes, before we answer your question. Yes.
I'm Zaki Jabba from the island newspaper Sri Lanka. You know, I come from a country which has just gone through a 30-year-old war. I come from a country which has just gone through a 30-year-old war, and obviously I'm opposed to war because I know the sufferings of war. Now, you know, we are talking of democracy and dictatorships. You know, a dictator is what he is. I mean, we know he's a dictator. But the fact is that in the democratic world, you get democratically elected leaders who achieve what they want through their military and economic power. So they are, at the end of the day, they are dictators under the cover of democracy. Now, coming to this, the Russian journalist who said, North Korea uses threat and coercion. Well, I'm opposed to war, I'm opposed to dictators, fine. North Korea uses threat and coercion, fine. Everybody does it. The democratic world does it, even children do it. Everybody does it in personal life to achieve their objectives. Whether it's right or wrong is debatable. And you also said, if everybody had nuclear power, there won't be war. Right, I agree with you. Now, this may not be very practical, but my question is this. Well, we are talking of nuclear disarmament. What North Korea is doing is wrong. But have we ever sat down and thought why the existing nuclear powers don't disarm themselves. Set an example and start from there.
All right? Whom are you asking your question to?
The panel in general, whoever. Obviously one question is to
now,
the
Russia
Russian
has
journalist.
nuclear weapons, so...
Well, it's very simple.
Yeah, I'll give you a chance. So I will ask the questions to Mr. Strokan. Yeah, the third question. Yes. Yeah, the gentleman back there. Yes. Now, we have plenty of time. We may finish by 5:30, so don't worry. I'll give you a chance for your questions to everyone, if possible. And panelists will be thinking about their answer before they respond to you. Yes.
Thank you for your all. My name is Sayyid Abdin from Dar al-Khalij, United Arab Emirates. I have three subjects. Number one for Mr. Wang. Please, Mr. Wang, speak about the core elements which determine the Chinese position on Korean Peninsula affairs, especially the issue of support of North Korea nuclear program, and deterioration of two Korean relations. This is three elements, in my opinion, is very important to speak about from Chinese opinion. Number two, for Ms. Tanaka, from 2 weeks, there were official meetings between Japan and North Korea. To what extent these events reflects new trends in the Japanese policy towards North Korea? Number three, for Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, from your words, the full responsibilities return to North Korea. But North Korea accuse other side, especially your country and United States of America, and maybe Japan, take the nuclear issues north. North Korea said it not need two nuclear weapons in principle, and it make nuclear explosion too deterrent, saying America want to invade North Korea and remove political system. And South Korea speak about reunification as absorption processes. And as you know, Peaceful Unification Committee introduced questionnaire to President Park contained 10 questions on reunification. Your comment, please.
Well, sir, don't ask too many questions. You have asked 3 questions, but just make 1. All right? So I'll see if our panelists can handle your questions in their own way, but for the sake of the other participants, just make 1 good question so that everyone can participate. Yes, the lady.
Hello, Philippa McDonald from Australia. Simon, I was really interested in what you had to say about the people in North Korea and the defectors that you'd spoken to. So my question, could you just build a little bit about what some of those defectors have told you about the quality of life in North Korea? I'm a TV reporter, it's a short question.
Maybe I can stop inviting questions and ask the panelists to respond, and then I will give you another round of chance for the asking questions. Now, let me start with Mr. Lee on the question by a lady from Thailand.
Yes. Well, with regards to the unified Korea, the future of unified Korea is, I think, clear. The South Korea, the Korean Peninsula were divided in 1945 by their great powers, the Russia and the United States and other countries. So South Koreans really want to resume as it were in 1945. And we would like to have, well, if it is available, we'd like to have a peace process based on the stability. But think about what if something happened, like as the Chu Surong of the Tsinghua University in China said, if North Korea make a sudden collapse, I think we should have a contingency plan, and I prefer to have the step-by-step approach to achieve the full unification and one country and one nation. And with regards to the first reporter's question, where you mentioned that the North Korea, they insisted that the United States want to invade, and President Park Geun-hye of South Korea would like to have observation of North Korea. And first of all, North Korea is very skillful to use the propaganda. So they are, I think, trying to let other countries confused with regards to Korean Peninsula. But it is, I'm sure that the United States, probably, maybe you can make Simon, you can make a comment. I don't think the United States and South Korean government have any intention to make an invasion. In 1991, the two Korea agreed to not to make any bad propaganda against other parties, and not to have the nuclear weapons and not to develop any nuclear materials. That's why we have the, I think, we can ask North Korea to stop and to stop make a nuclear weapon and to comply with what we agreed in 1991. At that time, we abandoned all of the United States forces nuclear system. So in South Korea, we don't have any nuclear material and nuclear system. All of the nuclear system were be back to the United States in 1992, following the 1991 agreement between two countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, and may I invite Mr. Strokhan to respond to the second question?
Yeah. The question was of nuclear disarmament, yes? Let me say that you said that there's no nuclear disarmament or something like that, yes? Do I get it right? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. But it is not true that we don't have any nuclear disarmament. And in fact, major nuclear powers, which are United States and Russia, which stockpile the major, weapon arsenals, meaning warheads and warhead carriers, they, as you know, they have signed START 1 agreement that was during Gorbachev time, and in recent time, U.S. Congress ratified in December 2012 START 2 Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, Russian-American Treaty, which envisages the most dramatic cuts, the most drastic cuts of nuclear warheads and missiles in the history of disarmament. So we can't say that we don't have any nuclear disarmament at all among the major nuclear powers. Moreover, the country which is most of all interested in nuclear disarmament is the United States, because of its advantages in conventional weapons. So if we imagine that one day there are no nuclear weapons and there are only conventional weapons, that will only reinstate American dominance, because they are much more ahead of any country in conventional weapons. So there's one agenda which is for nuclear states. This is nuclear disarmament, and two powers, United States and Russia, have already set the example. Of course, we were not followed by other major nuclear powers, which you know are Big Five of Security Council, which are reluctant to abandon the nuclear arsenals, but still the process is there. The second set of questions is related to threshold nuclear states. The states which are in the process of developing nuclear weapons. And this is relevant to to North Korea. So we should not allow erosion of nuclear proliferation regime. We should not see mushrooming more and more nuclear states, whether it is Korean Peninsula, or this is the Middle East, or this is other part of the world. And that's why there's no contradiction, no conflict in that. Yes, nuclear powers, major nuclear powers, are interested in nuclear disarmament, and their vision of that also envisages using all mechanisms to prevent the erosion of nuclear proliferation mechanism and creation of more nuclear powers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strokhan. And let me turn to Mr. Wang and Ms. Tanaka, and then to Mr. Mundy. Mr. Wang. Question of the Chinese position of the Korean Peninsula was a question put by a gentleman from Arab Emirates on North Korea, nuclear.
North Korea, yeah. Yes. In the history, China supported North Korea. That's the fact everybody knows. But now, China supported the reunification of the peninsula. And I think after the third nuclear test, China strongly denounced. And the position, I'm not the Chinese government official, but I think the position is China support the progress, any progress of the reunification, and is trying to play a role in the process.
Okay. Ms. Tanaka.
I want to clarify the question. Was
Japan's policy towards North Korea is in the recent negotiations is in fact changing the Japanese policy towards the North?
Right. Okay. There's no actual change in Japan's basic policy toward North Korea, even after the Japan-North Korea talks. The top government spokesman, when announcing the recent agreement between Japan and North Korea, has repeated that Japan will stick to the Pyongyang Declaration, what it stated in Pyongyang Declaration, that it will both try to resolve the abduction issue as well as the nuclear and missile issues, and also work on the settlement of the unfortunate past. So in that sense, there is no change of basic policy toward North Korea.
Next, Mr. Mundy, about defectors.
Thanks. The experiences of the people that I've met from North Korea span, I suppose, from the early 60s to a couple of years ago. I mean, I've met a couple of North Korean government officials, but I don't necessarily take their word for what the conditions are like right now. So it's the defectors who I think can give the best idea of the conditions. In the 60s, the North Korean economy was actually stronger than the South Korean economy. There was a very successful industrialization plan and a lot of economic assistance from China and the Soviet Union. So at that time, life was okay. People had enough to eat, more or less. Unfortunately, North Korea was putting far too much resources into the military, over-farming farmland, and you ended up with a point in the early 90s when famine hit. Although, in fact, defectors who were alive in the 80s always tell me that throughout the 80s, rations started getting more and more infrequent. And in the early 90s, people started starving to death in their hundreds of thousands. And the stories that everyone I know who was in North Korea in the 1990s just has the kind of stories that just make your flesh crawl. It's horrible. Just streets lined with bodies, especially for some reason railway stations, just corpses stacked up on top of another, children just sort of turning into feral animals, just running around desperately trying to find some way to survive. North Korea is not like that anymore. Various things have changed. One thing that's helped is a resumption of economic cooperation with China. The trade with China is now huge. The formal trade, which is largely China buying North Korean mineral resources, but also the informal trade. So especially the people that I know tend to come from the north because it's closer to the Chinese border, obviously, and it's easier for them to escape from there. So that sort of means that I'm particularly aware of what things are like in the border regions. There, life has been totally transformed over the last 15 years. So for one thing, as I mentioned, the films and especially the South Korean TV dramas, which have taken the whole of Asia, or much of Asia, by storm, and North Korea is no different. So one person I know from the city of Haesan was telling me that they get the dramas about a week after the South Koreans got them, and they would be copying the styles. Girls would try and sort of copy the stars from those shows, and this person I know was telling me that everyone, well, 75% of people, she said, more or less, were watching these shows. Economically, no one really relies on the state for food anymore. People will often bribe their manager, their overseer at work to allow them to skip work for the day so they can go and make money in the market. For whatever reason, it's mostly women running these informal markets. The men seem to more often actually go to their official job, where often they're just standing around in a factory that's not really operating. Meanwhile, it's largely the black economy is largely a female run economy. The food situation has improved largely because the terrible farming practices of the past, I think, have improved. There's more intelligent use of fertilizer. I think there's been more reforestation of the hills, because when the hills were deforested, it resulted in huge soil erosion, so the water came and swept away all the topsoil. I think that situation has improved. There's more farming machinery coming in. So life is better, but although starvation has stopped, malnourishment is still very common. A lot of children are still stunted. So although things are better, they're still not good by any means.
Thank you. May I invite further questioners from the audience? Yes, the lady first, and then, yes, the gentleman, and the gentleman in the middle, and fourth. Again, Miss, please.
Okay, I have very brief comments and questions. First, about the reunification. I don't think it's a problem about whether China supports and opposes the reunification process. So I have a question. So whether there is a consensus among the South Korean people that they advocate for the reunification process, are they willing to bear the huge economic burden once if the two Koreas truly reunite? The second question is about the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. I found that we only talk about the North Korea nuclear issue, but few people mention that actually South Korea has a nuclear umbrella provided by the United States, and another rival of the North Korea, Japan, actually has 44 tons of plutoniums, which can enable Japan to produce 5,500 nuclear weapons. So if we want to truly resolve the North nuclear issue, why don't we just put the two things together? The third problem is that...
No, not too many. No. Please. Just two, I think, will be enough. Sorry. Now, the first question will be to Mr. Lee, and the second question will be to Ms. Tanaka, perhaps. And then I will invite gentlemen. Yes.
Stefan Blommert from Belgian television. Mr. Lee said in his remarks that we need a contingency plan in case of a collapse of the regime in North Korea. So my question to Mr. Lee and maybe Mr. Mundi also, is South Korea in any way prepared to such a scenario? Of course, we don't expect the regime to collapse in the next few days, even the next few years. But, well, as a young reporter, I was covering the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. And at that time also, nobody predicted them to collapse. So you never know. So my question is South Korea prepared to that?
Thank you for the question. That will be to Mr. Lee. You're a busy man, Mr. Lee, today.
Yeah.
And is that also to Mr. Mundi, too? Okay, Mr. Mundi. About the contingency plan. And?
Can I have?
Yes, I had one gentleman. Oh, yes, over there, gentleman. I'll give you a chance. Yes, gentleman over there. Yes, yes, with a red tie. Yes.
I'm Ranjit Kumar from India. I would like to know from all the panel members, what is your assessment of the independent capability of the nuclear and missile scientists of North Korea to develop these high technology systems? are they getting support from any outside agency for developing these high technology weapon systems? Thank you.
Is that question to all of the?
To all, yeah.
Especially to whom?
I would like to address this question from all the members because they might have independent assessment of this.
But it'll take much time for them to answer.
Very short, brief answer.
Okay, then I will ask the panel members if they're interested in responding to your question, Mr. Kumar. Yes, Mr. Santosa.
My name is Teguh Santosa. I am from Indonesia. I'm addressing my questions to Mr. Lee again. Do you agree if I'm saying that we are losing trust among the members of six-party talk? That is why then we don't have any good result after so many years. So if that's the case, that we are losing the trust among these six-party trust, among them, and if you agree with that, saying that we are losing trust among them, do you think that we need to, let's say, reconstruct the six-party talk by adding a new members, let's say, a new member state that doesn't have any direct interest to the Korean Peninsula issue? Because once you have all of these six states talking about Korean Peninsula on the same table, and each of them, see, they have something with the issue, then I think we cannot trust any of them. Thank you.
All right, let me invite one more. Yes, the lady in the, yeah. Could you please give her a microphone? Please make your question very
brief, right?
Clear, succinct.
Yeah. Okay, my question is to Mr. Mandi. In your presentation, you talked about the second way to topple, the second way which the North Korean regime can be toppled would be by a civil society protest, which you think the situation has changed. People are now not adhering or not relate to the ideology which they were in the 80s or the 60s, and now their ideology is completely sort of different and changing. But you also, in the answer to the Australian reporter, you talked about how the condition are still the basic amenities, the basic needs are not met of the people. So if, like you said, the children are still stunted, their growth is not there. So how do you even think that if the basic necessities are not met, a protest on a larger scale, is it even possible? Is it, do they even have the strength or the capacity to engage in something of this sort? So
there was a question to you, Mr. Mandi. Can I make one more question? Yes, gentleman over there.
저 이강화 정보예측연구소장입니다. 오늘 잘 들었습니다. 그런데 핵심은 해결책이 나와야 됩니다. 제일 중요한 것은 우선 세계 패권국가 미국의 입장을 먼저 생각해야 됩니다. 우선 미국의 일본의 방사능이든 중국의 스모그에 의한 미세먼지든 제트기류에 의해서 미국까지 어떻게 도달하는가가 문제의 초점이 될 겁니다. 그 다음에 지금 이 세계는 역사적으로 지정학적으로 기존의 패권 국가에 대해서 신생 국가가 도전했을 때 그 패권 국가의 국익에 반하면은 큰 전쟁 또는 세계대전이 났습니다. 일례로 태평양 횡단철도 전쟁만 이야기를 하겠습니다. 제1차 태평양 횡단철도는 카나다 태평양 횡단철도입니다. 1823년 크림 전쟁인데 터키 영토인 크림반도에 제정 러시아가 침공을 하니까 영벌유럽군이 반격을 했는데 문제는 카나다 태평양 횡단철도로 대서양에서 태평양으로 보급을 지원군을 보내는 데 15일 단축된 영불연합군이 이겼습니다.
네,
조금만요.
질문을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. Please ask your question. 그리고요, 우리 주제와 관련된 질문을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. 우리 지금 한반도 통일에 대해서 얘기를 하고 있기 때문에 예. Okay. The question was whether China is willing to prevent any conflict in the world. So, well, thank you very much. Now, I would like to ask each of the panelists to respond to the questions were put by the ladies and gentlemen. First one, to Mr. Lee, whether there's a consensus in South Korea about the unification. And two, how about the nuclear umbrella by United States towards South Korea by the lady from China. And then six-party talks, because they are losing threats. Are there any ideas about losing trust? Sorry, threats from you, but trust. So are there any ideas about adding new members, Mr. Lee?
Yeah. I have never thought that I am receiving too many questions. Yeah. First of all, with regards to the consensus, yes, in South Korea we have a lot of consensus, especially the South Korea's first female president, Park Geun-hye, became president last year. She is pursuing, as someone said, the unification bonanza or unification jackpot. Many South Koreans try to rethink what kind of a benefit will be come from after the unification. So I'd like to say yes, we have I think consensus in comparison with 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And with regards to the nuclear umbrella, some the United States having nuclear umbrella in Korean Peninsula that is what North Korea is talking about. I don't think you are representing North Korea. As I mentioned, South Korea is asking, and the United States asking that the removal of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction, just because we agreed in 1991 not to have any nuclear weapon or not to develop any nuclear program. That's why I think the North Korea has a liability to answer this issue. So the disarmament talks is what North Korea is asking these days. And with regards to the contingency plan, yeah, I'm not working for the South Korean CIA, but I vaguely understand and know that we have the contingency plan step by step. And sometimes the news was made with regards to the contingency plan, and the contingency plan started with the number 2, something like this, and very specific contingency plan are being made under the Park Geun-hye administration. I think that is one of the reasons the North Korean, the Kim Jong-un regime is, they are not trying to have the dialogue with South Korea. Lastly, the adding the new members to six-party talks, thank you, but I think I should say thank you, but that is not a good solution, because the five-party talks didn't have one solution and one method to resolve this issue. So I don't think that is the good option to resolve the North Korean nuclear crisis. But that is, I think, one of the great, I think, suggestions to redevelop and make a rebuilding in North Korea after North Korea regime collapsed, or if the unification process started. I think we should add other members. Actually, I think the Australia and the Canadian government, they are really eager to participate in the six-party talks and the rebuilding process in North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Now, next, perhaps I should turn to Ms. Tanaka about the question about Japan's potential accumulation of the plutonium. Would you like to?
Okay. I think we should talk this issue separately. I want to emphasize that the Japanese government is under the IAEA safeguards in regard of plutonium, and our policy is not to hold excessive plutonium other than for peaceful purposes. And the plan is to use plutonium for commercial nuclear power, to consume it for commercial nuclear power plants. But if as you pointed out, if there is some concerns about this, I think the Japanese government needs to make more efforts to ensure the transparency of the accumulation of the plutonium.
Thank you, Ms. Tanaka. Mr. Mundy on the defectors.
Thanks for your question. I think one really important difference, and you brought up the parallels with the breakup of the communist states in East Europe. The big difference is, from what I've read about the communist states in Eastern Europe, there are always a lot of dissenting intellectuals, people meeting in kitchens and just talking about how in the long term a better society could be built. There's none of that in North Korea. I've never heard about any kind of organized dissent in North Korea. I think one of the reasons why that's different is because North Korea invests, as far as I know, more than any other country in history has, in repression, in surveillance of the population. One person from North Korea told me he claimed that at least 1/10 of the students at Kim Il-sung University are spies. Now, that may or may not be true, but the point is that is what someone who did go to university in North Korea felt like. He felt like at least 1/10 of his classmates were spies. So that's how people feel. And under those circumstances, North Korean people are much like people anywhere else. Their priorities are their families and their own livelihoods, just material comforts to just have a decent life. If I were in their position, I would think it's probably not worth the risk of trying to organize some kind of resistance when the most likely outcome for that is being sent to a gulag. So I think that's the problem. I don't think it's a problem with lack of physical strength. I think, people, although many of them are not healthy, people would be physically capable of taking to the streets and protesting. But I think the problem is more to do with the security apparatus of the North Korean state. Thanks.
Thank you. The question remaining is from the Indian journalist about independent and capable nuclear missile capabilities. And what was the question? You mean North Korea? Okay. Would anybody, any panelists want to respond to the question that would North Korea be able to develop its nuclear missile capabilities without any outside assistance, or would they need some external support to move towards that goal?
Very briefly.
Yes, Mr. Strokan.
Yeah. Mr. Kumar, as you understand, North Korean nuclear program is a top secret. It's very difficult to speak about the rules. However, probably remember when there was a controversy in Pakistan during the time of Pervez Musharraf rule, his controversy with the father of Pakistan nuclear bomb, Mr. Khan. During that time, if I'm not mistaken, there were publications over that leaks of nuclear technologies from Pakistan to other countries, including North Korea. And as I understand, at some point, somewhere probably 10, 15 years back, this Khan Center, which is in Pakistan, which is the nursery of Pakistan nuclear weapons, it served also as a, commercial venture, I would say, and it was probably involved in that smuggling of those technology. Those reports are not verified, but it looks like really there was some Pakistan connection over that.
Oh, yes, Mr.
I think from what I've read on this, it seems that Iranian scientists have been present at various nuclear and missile activities in North Korea, and clearly there has been extensive cooperation with Iran. Also, when there was a Syrian weapons operation that was bombed by Israel, and reportedly there were signs of North Korea having assisted the Syrian operation, so there may have been some kind of assistance going in the other direction. There was a large missile carrier that was shown off by North Korea at a military parade which, according to independent analysts, came from China. It's not clear whether that was with the permission of the Chinese government or whether it was somehow smuggled through illicit means. And I think a lot of the materials that North Korea has been using, one presumes, have gone through China. So it was interesting that China last year published a very, very long list of banned items that it would no longer allow to be transmitted to North Korea, so as to hold back the nuclear program, which seems encouraging.
With regard to the question from the lady, Mr. Strauss-Kahn would like to respond from the gentleman. From the gentleman, yes, about losing trust in the six-party talks. Mr. Strauss-Kahn.
Probably you will disagree with me, but I'm sure that we are losing trust, we are losing confidence. You know that there's a lot of talk over the new Cold War in the world, and we are losing, if we are losing trust in Ukraine, in Syria, in Iran and other issues, how can you imagine that we will not lose trust on North Korea? So this is very interdependent, and this is the general tendency. Then you are saying, if we are losing trust, if we are seeing the erosion, basic erosion of confidence, probably we can revamp consider this mechanism, probably expand that. Yes, do I get it right? You were hinting on that, yeah? Probably to make it bigger, yeah? Well, it sounds good, but the thing is, the problem is that if you set the task of expanding it, then the next question would be, what would be the criteria of selection of newcomers? Shall we invite Indonesia, or shall we invite Turkey, or shall we invite Brazil? What should be the criteria? You know how difficult it is to resolve the issue of expansion of Security Council of UN, because each country is trying to push its candidature. Indians want to be there, Germany wants to be there, other countries want to be there. So, and all in all, we will find ourselves in a situation when we will be involved in other endless debate who will join the group of six-party and who will not join. I don't think we can afford ourselves this, because, again, we are facing this uphill battle of resolving nuclear North Korean issues. That's why we have to, with all of its imperfect nature, we have to take it for granted that we have this mechanism, imperfect mechanism of six-party talks, but still the workable mechanism, and improve it, and not to allow confidence to erode further.
Thank you. There's one question remaining, if I understand correctly, from a gentleman, that there is a pattern of geopolitical contest between hegemonic power and the newly emerging power. And the question is regarding China, Mr. Wang. Is China willing to prevent the geopolitical conflict by not pursuing to become a hegemonic power? That was a question I understood. So do you have any comments on this?
Well, okay. Well, I think the Chinese government has repeatedly stressed that this country will not pursue hegemony at any time in any form. The answer from me is no. And China is, the country is now paying its attention, I should say entire attention to its economic development. And the GDP of the country has moved up to the second, just after the United States of America. And it is playing a role, more and more important role in international affairs. But the country is a peace-loving country. The people is a peace-loving people. It won't pursue that role. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now, I have a very important question to put to the organizers. Are we supposed to finish by 4:30 or 5:30? In a small brochure, it says from 2:30 to 4:30. In my schedule, it says 5:30. Wrap up now? Okay. Would you like to continue? Maybe. I think it's, time is almost up. But I really appreciate your patience and attention regarding this discussion. It was very exciting, very stimulating, and very productive debate. We had a lot of different views or convergent views about the unification, the inter-Korean relationship, and the geopolitical environment. I'll tell you just one short episode before I close. I used to serve the president of this country in 1993. That was President Kim Yong-sam. That was about 3 years after the unification of the Germany, the two Germanys. Now, Helmut Kohl, the chancellor of the United Germany, visited the Blue House in Korea and gave us an advice on what to do when the window of opportunity opens for the Korean unification. Chancellor Helmut Kohl said to our president that, Mr. President, when the window of opportunity opens, you should grab it like we did. So our president was very grateful to him. And then 6 months later, another Helmut from Germany came to Korea. This time it was Helmut Schmidt from different political party. And he said to our president, Mr. President, if the window of opportunity opens on the Korean peninsula for the reunification, then you should think twice before grabbing it. So President asked me which advice is the correct one. So I said to him, sir, I think both advices are right. Because maybe we should grab it, but when we grab the opportunity, we should know what is going to unfold after we decide to begin to reunify our country, especially economic, social, and cultural transformation of the Korean peninsula. I think it would be very significant changes that we might have to go through. So today's discussion was, in that sense, very insightful and also very helpful. Now, I hope that our discussion today will help us understand the conditions and the preparations for the future unification of the Korean Peninsula. We don't know when it is going to take place, but if we get some lesson from the German unification, then I think that the lesson is that people in North Korea themselves should be willing to unify with South Korea, because we cannot force them to do so. Mr. Strauss-Kahn made this point very clearly. And two, we will never know when this is going to happen. It could happen unexpectedly on the Korean peninsula. And we need to prepare for that long process of the transformation of a country. Now, I know you're reasonably hungry, and I thank all the panelists for their active participation in the discussion. And also, I know that you have many more questions, but please save it for the dinner time. So these panelists don't go away, except Mr. Lee, who has to take care of his desking in the Chosun Ilbo. Please. Yeah, I will talk to you afterwards. So tomorrow you will visit demilitarized zone. You will get closer to North Korea, and I hope you can feel and see what is going on beyond the cross-border on the Korean peninsula. And thank you very much, everyone. And I'll talk to you, Mr. Journalist from Sri Lanka, don't worry. But dinner is ready, and thank you for your participation. The session is closed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's give our panelists another round of applause, and thank you again to Dr. Park Jin for moderating today. Before we break, I would like to remind you all that promptly at 5:50 p.m., we request your presence just down the street at President Hotel for dinner, which will be held at the Schubert Hall on the 31st floor. So please make sure you are there on time. Dinner will be served at 6 p.m. Also, just another reminder, we are going to have one more commemorative photo. I promise it's the last one today. After you leave the hall, if you can make your way downstairs and through the front door of the press building, we will take a picture on these steps in front of the press center. So please make sure that you head downstairs and through the front doors of the press building. Thank you again for your attention and participation. This concludes Conference 1 of the 2014 World Journalist Conference. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.